Imagine a woman sitting in the quiet of her kitchen at 5 a.m. The house is perfectly still. The mortgage is paid. The promotion was secured last week. This is the exact life she sketched out on a napkin a decade ago. She has crossed the finish line. By all accounts, this should be the morning she finally breathes easy. She takes a sip of her coffee. She stares out the window. And then something terrifying happens. Nothing. There's no profound sense of arrival. There's no magical relief. Instead, a cold, heavy emptiness drops into her stomach. A single, haunting question echoes in the silence. Is this really all there is? She is not panicked because she failed. She is panicked because she succeeded. She reached the very top of the mountain, and success didn't fix her. Why do millions of people wake up every day exhausted, running on a treadmill of achievements, waiting for a revelation that never arrives? We watch people conquer their biggest goals only to quietly break down when they realize the mountain owes them absolutely nothing. What exactly is this invisible trap? And what if the deep exhaustion you feel right now is not a sign that you need to try harder, but a sign that you are chasing an answer no one can actually give you? So Elias sat in the corner office on the 42nd floor of the Frankfurt Financial District. And behind him, this heavy mahogany door was closed, completely muting the sounds of champagne corks popping in the hallway outside.
And that physical isolation right there, that's highly indicative of the psychological state we're really diving into today.
Yeah.
Because the celebration, the socially mandated response to a victory, it's happening in a completely separate physical space from where he actually is.
Yeah, he's totally removed from it. I mean, he had just secured this massive corporate merger, a deal that effectively guaranteed the senior vice presidency he had just bled for over 10 years.
Years of his life.
10 years. It was the zenith of this invisible contract he had essentially written for himself. Like, if I achieve this, then the hollow ringing in my chest will finally stop.
Right, the if-then model.
But instead, as he stared at this panoramic view of the twilight skyline, the silence inside him just expanded into this crushing vacuum.
Yeah, and that invisible contract you're talking about, that is the literal foundation of what Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, a positive psychology researcher, defines as the arrival fallacy.
The arrival fallacy.
Right. It's this pervasive cognitive illusion that reaching a specific quantifiable destination, in a salary bracket, a house, is going to somehow confer a state of permanent psychological satiety.
Like it's just going to fix you permanently.
The whole condition is predicated on this very linear model of human fulfillment. We think, hey, effort leads to achievement, and achievement permanently elevates my baseline well-being. But Elias is right there, confronting the exact moment that model breaks down entirely.
Because the promotion was basically a phantom. The adrenaline of the chase was already decaying into this profound, just paralyzing exhaustion.
It's crashing
hard. He realized he was trapped on this gilded treadmill, basically trading his present reality for futures that just immediately dissolved into new, distant anxieties the absolute second he arrived. So he just pressed his forehead against the cold, immaculate glass of the window, feeling the faint vibrations of the traffic 42 floors down.
Just grounding himself.
Yeah, he completely ignored the congratulatory knocks on his door. For the first time in a decade, he actually stopped plotting the next fiscal quarter. He just focused on the rhythm of his own breathing and the freezing condensation on the glass, just anchoring himself to the absurd but undeniable reality of a single unmonetized second.
Unmonetized. That's the key word there, because when Elias leans against that glass and feels that sudden decay of adrenaline, he's not just having a philosophical crisis.
Right.
I mean, he's undergoing a severe neurobiological event. To really understand this arrival fallacy objectively, we have to look at the work of neuroscientists like Andrew Huberman, specifically regarding the human dopaminergic system.
Because there's a huge misconception about dopamine.
There is this deeply ingrained societal idea that dopamine operates as a reward chemical, like it's some neurochemical trophy handed out by the brain when you finish a difficult task.
Yeah, the common understanding treats dopamine like the champagne popping in the hallway outside Elias's office, like it's the celebration molecule. But if it were the celebration molecule, Elias would be flooded with it right then. He'd feel this overwhelming sense of contentment. The fact that he feels a crushing vacuum suggests the chemistry works completely in reverse.
It operates entirely in reverse. Dopamine is not reward, it is motivation, it's anticipation, it's pursuit. Think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. Early humans needed a neurochemical driver that would force them to track prey for days across hostile terrain, right? Completely ignoring physical exhaustion and hunger.
Just locked in.
Dopamine narrows your visual focus. It increases your physical energy, and it amplifies cognitive sharpness, specifically when a goal is perceived but not yet attained. It is literally the chemical of the chase.
The chemical of the chase. So it spikes highest during the friction and the struggle of actually trying to get the thing, which means the moment the prey is caught, or, in Elias's case, the moment the ink dries on that Frankfurt merger, the evolutionary utility of dopamine just stops. The biological imperative is fulfilled. So the brain immediately downregulates dopamine production.
Shuts it off abruptly. And that results in this precipitous dopamine crash. So Elias is standing in a newly conquered neurobiological vacuum.
God.
For 10 years, his baseline neurochemistry has been artificially elevated by the anticipation of this specific senior vice presidency. The sudden removal of that anticipatory molecule leads his nervous system in a state of sudden chemical deprivation.
So it's withdrawal.
Basically. And this explains the specific phenomenon of post-achievement depression that we see documented so frequently in high performers. The brain surveys the newly conquered summit, registers this massive drop in dopaminergic stimulation, and just enters its state of cognitive distress.
So if the biological design literally forces a crash upon arrival, then human beings are fundamentally engineered for perpetual dissatisfaction.
Sadly.
Which totally aligns with the concept of the hedonic treadmill. That was formulated by psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald T. Campbell.
Right, the hedonic treadmill.
So their theory basically posits that human beings possess this remarkable, almost ruthless capacity for hedonic adaptation. Like, a major positive or negative life event will temporarily alter your level of subjective well-being, but you will inevitably and really rapidly return to a relatively stable baseline.
You just get used to it.
Yeah.
And Dan Gilbert's research on effective forecasting really complicates this adaptation process even further.
Effective forecasting.
Yeah, effective forecasting just refers to the human ability to predict our future emotional states, how you think you'll feel in the future. And Gilbert's empirical studies demonstrate that individuals are systematically and dramatically inept at this prediction.
We're just terrible at guessing how we'll feel.
Horrible at it. Humans exhibit what he calls an impact bias. We chronically overestimate both the intensity and the duration of our future emotional reactions. So when Elias negotiated this career path a decade ago, his effective forecast predicted that this Frankfurt merger would yield intense, permanent satisfaction.
But he failed to account for his own psychological immune system. He didn't anticipate that within days, or perhaps even hours, that corner office would completely cease to be a monumental achievement and would just become his new baseline reality.
Exactly.
The view of the skyline just becomes background noise. The new salary bracket just becomes the new minimum requirement for survival.
It's just Tuesday now. And examining this through a sociological lens, particularly within the context of Western corporate environments, it reveals how this biological vulnerability is actually systematized.
How so?
Well, look at the work of Jake Smolrek. He did extensive documentation of over 27,000 hours of executive coaching with high net worth individuals.
27,000 hours. That's a massive data set.
Huge. And he identified a systemic exploitation of the arrival fallacy. In these hyper-optimized corporate structures, burnout isn't an anomaly. It is the designed output of the system.
Oh.
The infrastructure rewards continuous forward velocity while actively eliminating any mechanisms for internal, non-quantifiable alignment.
Right, because high achievers are inherently skilled at applying performance logic to complex problems. Like, if revenue is down, they optimize the supply chain. If a competitor emerges, they acquire them.
They fix it.
Yeah, but when an executive like Elias encounters an existential vacuum, which is a failure of meaning rather than a failure of profit, they intuitively deploy the only tool they possess: more performance logic.
They try to outperform the emptiness.
They set a new higher goal, just assuming the flaw wasn't in the pursuit itself, but in the scale of the target. Like, oh, VP wasn't enough. I need to be CEO.
And research from MIT Sloan highlights the catastrophic consequences of applying performance logic to existential deficits. The data indicates that executives trapped in this cycle experience profound decision fatigue.
Because they're just running on empty.
Right, because every single action is tethered to a future conditional state of arrival. The cognitive load required to sustain that illusion becomes immense. They are depleting finite executive functioning resources, attempting to calculate a logistical solution to a philosophical crisis.
Okay, but I have to push back on this premise just a bit. regarding the viability of simply discarding performance logic.
Sure.
Because in the environment, Elias and Happus, performance logic is not just a cognitive error, it's a structural mandate for survival. He has a fiduciary duty to a board of directors. If he recognizes this arrival fallacy and just decides, hey, I'm going to stop optimizing for the next quarter in order to find my internal alignment, he's going to be swiftly terminated, and he'll be replaced by someone who is still fully captivated by the dopamine chase.
Really?
The system demands that he run on the treadmill. So how can this condition be diagnosed purely as a psychological failure when it's literally a perfectly rational adaptation to a ruthless economic environment?
And it's a great point. But the arrival fallacy does not imply that Elias should cease corporate function. The fallacy lies in his internal allocation of meaning. The structural requirement to generate profit is an external reality. The psychological failure occurs when the individual conflates that external economic requirement with their internal metric for existential worth. Elias's profound exhaustion stems from expecting the corporate structure to provide a philosophical service it was never designed to offer. He outsourced his meaning to an entity that only processes margins.
Consider the mechanics of this through the analogy of ascending Mount Everest. So the traditional ascent is defined by extreme friction. It requires weeks of brutal trekking, exposure to freezing winds, and the slow, agonizing physiological adaptation of your lungs to oxygen deprivation.
Right, acclimatization.
The body is transformed by the demands of the environment. The summit is merely the final punctuation mark on a very long process of physical and psychological alteration. Now, imagine an individual with immense financial resources who just bypasses the climb entirely.
Just takes a shortcut.
Yeah, they charter a specialized helicopter, fly directly to the summit, and step out onto the snow.
Geographically, both the climber and the passenger occupy the exact same coordinates. They have both arrived.
But the passenger immediately begins to suffocate and collapse. They purchase the geographical result, but because they bypass the brutal friction, struggle, and the necessary adaptation, their physiological system literally cannot survive the environment.
They skip the transformation.
Exactly. When an individual outsources their meaning to an external metric like a promotion, a numerical target, they are attempting to helicopter to the summit. They arrive at the corner office without having cultivated the internal psychological infrastructure required to survive the altitude.
The friction itself is the mechanism of meaning. By attempting to eliminate the friction and fast-track the arrival, the individual just arrives hollow. And this dynamic of conditional living, where present reality is constantly sacrificed for an optimized future state, it's deeply entrenched in corporate executive strata. But the mechanism is not confined to high finance anymore. The identical psychological loop, the expectation of arrival, the outsourcing of meaning to external validation, and the subsequent dopamine crash has been algorithmically digitized and deployed at a global scale.
Yeah. If Elias is suffocating because he reached a static summit and found it empty, there's an entirely different demographic suffocating because the summit continuously shifts based on artificial intelligence models. This moves the analysis from the boardrooms of Frankfurt to a vastly different architectural space entirely. So let's look at Maya. It took 34 attempts to capture the perfect, effortless Sunday morning. Maya, perched on the edge of her heavily mortgaged Tokyo apartment, examined the grid on her screen. The lighting was ethereal. The artisanal pour-over coffee was perfectly staged. The drafted caption, a carefully calibrated performance of authenticity.
Authenticity, in quotes.
It was the absolute pinnacle of conditional living. Her sense of reality was entirely contingent on the influx of algorithmic validation that would arrive the moment she posted.
And Maya's meticulous curation of that coffee cup is the exact digital equivalent of Elias's corporate merger. Both are utilizing immense cognitive resources to construct an external artifact that they hope will trigger internal validation.
Yet as she stared at her flawlessly curated avatar, a wave of profound, suffocating numbness just washed over her. She realized she was a ghost haunting her own life, archiving beautiful moments she was never actually mentally present to experience.
She's just documenting it.
The coffee had grown cold and tasted like acidic dirt. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked incessantly, a jagged, unpolished sound that violently ruptured the sterile aesthetics of her digital sanctuary.
Reality bleeding in.
Her thumb hovered over the publish button. The sheer, bone-deep fatigue of constantly proving her existence suddenly outweighed the terror of being invisible. With a trembling hand, she deleted the photo, powered down the device, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the ruined cold coffee. It was bitter, It was ugly, and for the first time in 5 years, it was entirely hers.
And the behavioral loop Maya is trapped within, we can deconstruct that using B.J. Fogg's theoretical framework of persuasive technology.
Persuasive technology.
Technology in this context is not a neutral utility. Social media architectures deploy infinite scroll mechanisms, AI-driven content models, variable reward schedules.
Variable reward schedule, that's like the slot machine effect.
Modeled directly on operant conditioning mechanisms. If validation of the like, the comment, the algorithmic reach, if that were guaranteed and predictable, the dopaminergic response would quickly habituate.
The user would just adapt.
The hedonic treadmill again. The power of the design lies in its unpredictability. Maya does not know if the 34th attempt will yield 10 interactions or 10,000.
And that unpredictability acts as a multiplier for dopamine production.
The algorithm intentionally dangles the validation in a state of quantum uncertainty, fostering the phenomenon of doom scrolling. The user is locked in a state of continuous evaluation and intense FOMO, the fear of missing out. The nervous system is perpetually braced for reward that arrives just inconsistently enough to prevent adaptation, but consistently enough to prevent abandonment.
It's perfectly calibrated to keep you on the hook.
And this creates what is known as the external definition trap. Maya's perception of a successful Sunday morning is no longer derived from her sensory experience of the coffee or the physical restfulness of her apartment.
No, the definition of success has been entirely outsourced to the metric output of the platform.
And through the lens of existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, Maya is engaged in a profound state of bad faith.
Bad faith.
Bad faith occurs when an individual adopts false values or acts inauthentically to succumb to external pressures, essentially denying their own innate freedom.
So she is playing the role of the aesthetically perfect digital citizen so rigorously that she alienates herself from her own phenomenological reality. Like, the lived experience, the warmth of the mug, the sound of the city is entirely sacrificed just to generate the archived image of the experience.
The avatar becomes the primary entity.
Yeah, and the physical human becomes merely the logistics manager for the avatar.
Logistics managers. And the psychological toll of managing this avatar is quantifiable. There's a comprehensive study published in the journal Frontiers that analyzed Generation Z employees operating within the hyper-accelerated e-commerce sector.
Okay, what did they find?
The researchers identified a potent psychological variable termed social expectation pressure. Unlike previous generations, whose reference group for success was localized to their immediate physical community, coworkers, neighbors, family members, digital natives are exposed to a relentless, mathematically optimized stream of peer success on a global scale.
Because the mechanism driving this pressure is upward social comparison.
Yeah.
Evolutionary psychology suggests humans developed social comparison as a survival heuristic. Like, assessing your standing within a small tribe was completely necessary for resource allocation and group cohesion.
You had to know where you stood.
But the psychological hardware evolved for a tribe of perhaps 150 people. It is entirely unequipped to process a reference group that is global, unbounded, and highly curated. When Maya compares her Sunday morning, she isn't comparing it to the actual messy Sunday morning of a neighbor down the hall. She is comparing it to the top 0.1% of highly engineered aesthetic performances globally, fed to her precisely because they garner the highest engagement metrics.
And the Frontiers study, isolating this phenomenon, employed a really rigorous statistical technique known as propensity score matching. This is a critical methodological point here.
What is propensity score matching?
Well, in observational studies, it's difficult to determine if a variable like social media usage is actually causing a specific outcome, or if other confounding variables like baseline income or years of industry experience are the true drivers.
Right, correlation versus causation.
Propensity score matching controls for these variables by mathematically pairing an individual highly exposed to social expectation pressure with an individual of near identical demographic and professional characteristics who is not exposed to that pressure.
Oh, so it isolates the exact effect of the comparison by stripping away all the noise of socioeconomic differences.
It creates an apples-to-apples comparison. And by isolating that variable, the researchers found a staggering result. Upward social comparison mediated 55.6% of the relationship between social expectation pressure and turnover intention.
55.6%.
More than half of the variance in these young professionals' desire to abandon their current careers was directly driven by the accumulation of relative deprivation and self-doubt. And this was generated by comparing their unedited reality to the algorithmic highlight reels of a global reference group.
And this held true across the board.
It held true across vast enterprise organizations and small to medium enterprises alike. It's systemic.
But there is a structural argument to be made here regarding the platforms themselves.
Okay.
Because if the core driver of this crisis is the algorithm, the proprietary AI models designed to hijack dopaminergic pathways and force continuous upward social comparisons just to maximize ad revenue, the solution seems like it could be technical. If the code is the trap, one could simply restructure the environment to remove the algorithmic friction.
Right, the structural argument.
Right.
And this specific argument is currently being tested by decentralized alternative networks, such as the federated platform Mastodon. The architecture of a decentralized network inherently neutralizes several of the mechanisms B.J. Fogg identified. By operating on independent chronological feeds rather than engagement-based algorithms, and by removing corporate data harvesting, deploying transparent open-source moderation, these platforms essentially dismantle the variable reward schedule.
Because they aren't optimized for addiction.
They do not force-feed users the most outrage-inducing or envy-inducing content to maximize time on site.
However, observing the behavior on these decentralized nodes reveals a significant limitation to that structural solution. While chronological feeds remove the AI-driven upward comparison to, say, a global billionaire, the architecture of self-selected independent servers often inadvertently engineers highly insulated echo chambers. Users migrate to nodes that perfectly align with their pre-existing ideological or aesthetic preferences. The pressure to perform for an algorithm is just replaced by the pressure to conform perfectly to the hyper-specific purity tests of a homogeneous microcommunity.
The technical structure changes, but the underlying human vulnerability to the external definition trap remains completely intact. This suggests that while algorithmic design accelerates and exploits the crisis, it is not the root cause. Whether the pressure to define oneself externally emanates from the fiduciary demands of a Frankfurt boardroom or the glowing matrix of a Tokyo screen, the core condition is identical.
It is the human demand for a clear external narrative of meaning projected into a system that is fundamentally incapable of providing it. Which brings us to Julian. The automated fluorescent lights of the Seattle storage facility hummed, casting a sterile glare over the cardboard boxes containing the entirety of Julian's late father's life. Julian, a data architect accustomed to reducing human existence to predictive algorithms, sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, paralyzed by a rusted mechanical watch and a stack of heavily annotated paperbacks.
Julian's cognitive framework is built entirely on data architecture. He approaches reality with the expectation that sufficient data will inevitably yield a logical, structural answer.
Right. He had spent weeks searching through these artifacts for some profound, hidden meaning to justify his father's sudden absence. He was looking for the variable that would balance the equation of his grief. But the universe remained aggressively silent. He picked up his father's dog-eared copy of Camus alongside a small, tarnished brass Buddha, and the contradiction struck him with a quiet violence. The defiant, agonizing push of Sisyphus against a meaningless rock, placed right next to the radical surrender of letting the rock go.
In that moment, surrounded by the physical detritus of completed life, Julian's predictive models fail entirely. He has encountered the central premise of Albert Camus' philosophy, the concept of the absurd. And it is vital to articulate that Camus does not define the universe itself as absurd.
Wait, I thought that was the whole point of absurdism.
No, a common misconception. A stone is not absurd. A star is not absurd. They simply exist. The absurd is a relational dynamic. It is the violent, irreconcilable collision between the human demand for meaning, clarity, and rational order, and the universe's completely unreasonable silence in response to that demand.
So it's the collision that's absurd. So Julian realized his misery came from demanding a prepackaged answer from a post-industrial world that just had none to give. The silence of the warehouse wasn't a punishment. It was merely a canvas. He slipped the broken watch into his pocket, not as a sentimental anchor, but just to feel its meaningless weight. He let out a dry, cracking laugh that echoed down the metal corridors. He didn't need to decode the universe anymore. He just needed to carry the watch, abandon the desperate search for a grand design, and walk out into the cold rain.
Julian's sudden laughter in that metal corridor perfectly marks his transition from demanding meaning to recognizing the absurd. Camus outlines specific experiential triggers that awaken individuals to this absurdity.
Triggers?
Well, the primary trigger is the sheer, crushing monotony of mechanical life. The human being operates within a rigidly structured routine. The alarm clock, the commute, the repetitive labor, the meal, the sleep cycle. Monday through Friday, the pattern repeats with unquestioned momentum. But eventually, a moment arrives where, as Camus describes it, the stage sets collapse. The mechanical rhythm halts, and the individual asks a single devastating question.
Why am I doing this?
Exact.
And the second trigger Camus identifies is temporality and the horror of aging, which he terms the revolt of the flesh.
The revolt of the flesh, yes.
An individual lives oriented toward the future, right? We're always planning for the promotion, the retirement, the weekend. But suddenly there's this acute realization that this very future is synonymous with their own physical decay and inevitable death.
Time is literally destroying them.
Right. The realization that one belongs to time and that time is a mechanism of destruction forcibly strips away the illusion of forward progress.
And the third trigger is the profound experience of the ultimate unknowability of the world. An individual can look at a familiar landscape, a tree or a stone, and suddenly perceive its density and its alien nature. The world evades human comprehension because it is completely indifferent to human categorization.
It doesn't care what we call it.
It has no intrinsic relation to the thoughts or desires of the observer whatsoever. When Julian looks at the rusted watch, he realizes it possesses no inherent narrative about his father. It's merely gears and oxidized metal, entirely indifferent to his grief.
So, once an individual perceives this absolute silence, the philosophical challenge becomes one of methodology. How does one actually proceed after the stage sets have collapsed?
Right, how do you live?
Camus established a rigorous requirement. One must not commit what he called philosophical suicide.
Philosophical suicide.
Yeah. When the tension of the absurd becomes agonizing, the overwhelming human instinct is to make a transcendent leap. This involves adopting a pre-packaged belief system to artificially resolve the silence.
Just patching a hole.
Yes, it is the decision to invent a grand narrative, whether that is a theological framework dictating that suffering is part of a divine plan, or even a secular utopianism claiming that historical progress will eventually eradicate the void.
Camus argues that making this transcendent leap is an act of intellectual cowardice. It annihilates the absurd by destroying one half of the equation, the human demand for rational truth. To live authentically, one must reject these fabricated answers. The individual must stand fully conscious within the desert of the absurd, look the silence of the universe directly in the face, and rebel by continuing to live with passionate intensity without any appeal to a higher power or future salvation.
The ultimate illustration of this methodology is Camus' interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus. In the classical myth, the gods condemn Sisyphus to an eternal punishment. He has to push a massive boulder up the side of a mountain, only to watch it roll back down to the valley the exact moment it reaches the summit. Yeah, he must then walk back down and begin the labor again for all eternity. It is the absolute distillation of monotonous, meaningless, futile labor. It perfectly mirrors Elias running on the hedonic treadmill of corporate finance and Maya trapped in the variable reward schedule of algorithmic validation.
But Camus alters the focus of the myth. He analyzes Sisyphus during the walk back down the mountain. In that moment of pause, as he descends toward the rock, Sisyphus is fully conscious of his wretched condition. He harbors absolutely no hope that the rock will stay at the summit next time. He anticipates no rescue by the gods. Yet, by consciously choosing to walk back down and push the rock again, Sisyphus reclaims his agency. He transforms his punishment into his own willful action. The acceptance of the absolute meaninglessness of the task is the very mechanism that grants him mastery over his fate. The struggle itself is sufficient to fill a human heart.
And this philosophical framework intersects remarkably with the other artifact in Julian's storage unit, the tarnished brass Buddha. The synthesis of Camus's absurdism and Buddhist non-attachment is a subject of really profound academic analysis, such as the thesis work of Schuyler Anderson connecting these concepts through the lens of critical phenomenology.
Critical phenomenology.
Okay, to understand this intersection, it is necessary to examine the foundational assumptions of Western philosophy, specifically Cartesian mind-body dualism. René Descartes established the paradigm of I think, effectively severing the cognitive intellect from the physical body. Western thought subsequently prioritized the mind as the sole generator of meaning and truth, treating the body merely as a biological vehicle.
Just a meat suit carrying the brain around.
Exactly.
But critical phenomenology fundamentally rejects this separation. It argues that the body itself is an active agent of knowledge, Perception and physical engagement with the world are not just sensory data points fed to a detached mind. They are the primary mechanisms of understanding. When Camus emphasizes the physical reality of the sun, the sea, and the sheer muscular effort of Sisyphus pushing the rock, he is aligning with a phenomenological view that meaning is enacted physically, not deduced intellectually.
And this connects directly to Buddhist frameworks, specifically what scholar Roger R. Jackson terms bare-bones Buddhism.
Bare-bones Buddhism. Bare-bones Buddhism extracts the core functional philosophy of the tradition, mindfulness, an understanding of impermanence, and the concept of dependent origination without requiring the practitioner to make metaphysical, transcendent leaps into beliefs regarding literal reincarnation or karmic accounting systems.
So it avoids Camus' philosophical suicide.
It stays grounded in the physical reality.
And dependent origination is the critical concept here. It is the understanding that no entity possesses independent, isolated existence. Everything exists only in constant dynamic relation to everything else. This is frequently visualized through the metaphor of Indra's net.
I love Indra's net.
It's this infinite cosmic web where every intersection features a multifaceted jewel, and each jewel reflects the light of every other jewel in the net. So when Sisyphus pushes the rock, or when Julian walks out into the cold Seattle rain, they are not isolated minds trapped in meaningless meat suits. They are interconnected nodes experiencing the physical friction of reality. The realization of Indra's net serves as a logical counter to the nihilism that might arise from the absurd. An individual does not need a grand, divinely ordained destination to justify their existence. Their fundamental physical interconnectedness with the environment and with others provides sufficient grounding to continue pushing the boulder.
However, translating this highly abstract synthesis of phenomenology and absurdism into an actionable methodology within a post-industrial, hyper-optimized society presents a formidable challenge.
How do you actually do this on a Tuesday?
Right. Apathy is the constant threat. If an individual fully internalizes that the corporate summit is an illusion, that social validation is a localized algorithmic trap, and that the universe is inherently silent, the immediate practical question arises: how does one structure a Tuesday morning? Why execute the tasks of daily survival if the overarching architecture is completely devoid of inherent purpose?
Moving from philosophical acceptance to practical systems really requires examining models of extreme existential endurance. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the Auschwitz concentration camp, documented findings that perfectly mirror the requirement to construct meaning in the absence of external validation.
Man's search for meaning.
Frankl's environment was designed to systematically strip away every metric of human dignity, identity, and future orientation. Yet, his core realization was that meaning is never a byproduct of external circumstances. Meaning is the ultimate internal decision. It is the final, unassailable human freedom, the capacity to dictate one's own psychological response to any given set of conditions.
And applying Frankl's insight to the architecture of modern success requires a total recalibration of how individuals evaluate their own actions. Writer David Brooks categorizes this necessary shift as the transition from operating on resume virtues to operating on eulogy virtues.
Resume versus eulogy.
Right. Resume virtues are the quantifiable metrics that fuel the arrival fallacy. The titles, the capital accumulation, the algorithmic reach. They are external, they're competitive, and highly susceptible to hedonic adaptation.
Because they're on a treadmill.
Eulogy virtues are the qualitative, unquantifiable metrics of character. Courage, honesty, depth of connection, and ethical legacy. What people talk about at your funeral.
And an empirical example of this shift at the highest echelons of capitalist achievement is Yvon Chouinard, the founder of the outdoor apparel company Patagonia. By all external metrics of performance logic, Chouinard had reached the absolute zenith of the corporate mountain. He possessed a billion-dollar global empire.
He won the game.
He won. The systemic expectation was that he would maintain the resume virtue, perhaps optimize for greater shareholder return, or sell the entity for massive personal capitalization.
Instead, Chouinard fundamentally dismantled the game he had won. He transferred the entirety of the company's ownership to a specially designed trust and a nonprofit organization, ensuring that all future profits would be deployed to combat the global climate crisis.
Whoa.
He effectively annihilated his status as a billionaire. By doing so, he anchored his labor, his boulder, not to a resume virtue that would inevitably trigger a dopamine crash, but to a eulogy virtue that provided ongoing, sustainable friction and purpose.
The philosopher Martin Heidegger provides a really precise vocabulary for this required shift in daily operation. Heidegger critiqued modern humanity's default mode of existing as lords of the earth.
Lords of the earth.
Yeah, this mode is defined by calculative thinking. An individual operating as a lord of the earth views everything, time, the natural environment, other human beings, and even their own cognitive capacity strictly as a resource to be optimized, extracted, and stockpiled for future value.
Which is exactly what Elias was doing in Frankfurt.
This is the exact thinking that leads to the decision fatigue MIT Sloan observed in executives. It is the endless calculation of utility.
But Heidegger posits that the antidote to calculative thinking is adopting the posture of a shepherd of being. This requires cultivating a state he termed Gelassenheit, which translates roughly to letting be or serene releasement.
Gelassenheit.
And the distinction is profound. A lord of the earth calculates the future market value of a forest. A shepherd of being simply walks among the trees, acknowledging their existence without demanding they yield a profit. The shepherd finds profound meaning in the present tense act of tending to the environment, entirely divorced from the compulsion to extract future utility from it.
And the practical daily application of Gelassenheit can be achieved through a concept articulated by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, 8 teleological pursuits.
8 teleological pursuits.
Okay, the term teleological refers to an action that is driven by a specific end goal or destination. Brushing your teeth to prevent cavities is teleological. Executing a merger to secure a promotion is teleological. Curating a photo to achieve algorithmic reach is teleological.
Goal-oriented.
Therefore, an ateleological pursuit is an action deliberately stripped of any finish line, any metric of optimization, and any external quota.
The execution of teleological pursuits fundamentally short-circuits the neurobiology of the arrival fallacy entirely. Because there is no destination, there is no anticipation of a final reward, and consequently, no dopaminergic crash.
It is the act of going for a long walk in a city without a destination and without a step counter-tracking the physiological output. It is the decision to read a complex novel without the intention of extracting actionable data points for professional advancement. It is sitting alone in a room and playing a musical instrument torely, purely to experience the physical phenomenon of sound waves vibrating through the air, without any intention of ever performing for an audience or recording the output.
By engaging in activities where it is literally impossible to win, the individual forces their cognitive architecture to remain anchored in the present tense. They stop treating the current moment as a mere logistical stepping stone to a conditional future. When you synthesize these elements, understanding the biological reality of the dopamine cycle, recognizing the structural traps of algorithmic social expectation, accepting the sheer unreasonable silence of the universe without demanding false comfort, and systematically integrating non-optimized teleological friction into daily existence, the framework of the invisible trap begins to fail entirely.
True freedom is found only when one accepts that the mountain owes humanity no answers. In the absolute silence of that realization, individuals are finally unburdened, left entirely free to determine the weight and purpose of their own rock.